Halloween! I'm Kelsey, this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads, and I am wearing my fancy witch hat for one more time this October because today I am going to be reviewing Toil and Trouble 15 Tales of Women and Witchcraft, which is a YA anthology edited by Tess Sharpe and Jessica Spotswood, both of whom also have stories in this collection themselves. This was released back in August, and I had a digital copy for review via NetGalley. And I should mention, because you might have heard that arcs for this book did have a 16th story in them that was removed before the book was published due to allegations that arose against the author. That story was in fact in the arc I had. I did not read it and won't be reviewing it. So I would say that Toil and Trouble is a book of mostly uniformly good stories that suffers from too many of said stories feeling too similar to one another. Perhaps this was inevitable. The anthology's theme, which is young adult feminist stories about witchcraft, is narrow enough to invite certain very specific themes and writing styles. There are a lot of coming-of-age tales here. The vast majority, though not all of these stories, are urban fantasy. Most, though again not all, seem to take place in the United States, though they present diverse perspectives in other ways, including a plethora of LGBTQ+ and POC characters. And story after story tackles some combination of the themes of family legacies, family trauma, family ties between women, romance, heartbreak, superstition, and the power to wield magic for good or evil. So in this context, many otherwise strong contemporary teen witch tales do begin to blend into one another. Star Song by Taylor K. Mejia, The Heart in Our Hands by Tess Sharpe, The Truth About Queenie by Brandy Colbert, Divine Are the Stars by Zoraida Cordova, and The Jaren Girls by Emily Lord are all stories that are strong enough in their own right. But the elements that mark them each out from the crowd are overwhelmed by the things that they have in common. I'd have included The Legend of Stone Mary by Robin Talley in that list, except that it actually stood out to me as a favorite, though I'm not quite certain why. It's actually a retro period piece set in the 70s about a girl whose family traces their lineage back to a witch with a tragic story who may have cursed the town. Although the truth about Mary Keegan's history may have been forgotten by many, her descendants are still outcasts in the community, and the statue that townsfolk once erected to appease her anger, now called Stone Mary, still stands, and is a popular spot for teens to congregate. One year, young Wendy Keegan decides to go along to see Stone Mary on Halloween, and ends up confronting her family history in a properly spooky encounter that hit all the right notes for me. The only author in this collection whose work I had previously read was Anna Marie McLemore. I love her novels and was eager to see how her story Love Spell would compare. It's one of the few stories in this book that doesn't take place in the US. The location isn't specified, but it feels like Latin America. But it didn't end up leaving as much of an impact for me as her novels have. McLemore's writing is lovely and heartfelt as always, but her usual themes, which she always handles so elegantly, are so run-of-the-mill for this particular collection that the story doesn't stand out in the crowd. It makes me really think that the editors here have really done all of these talented authors a disservice by allowing so many of them to run in the same general direction with the prompt. Love Spell also had some elements in common with McLemore's novel When the Moon Was Ours, so some of it felt like I'd already read this from her before as well. For the most part, the stories that stood out to me, both for the better and for the worse, were the ones that diverged most strongly from the formula. An early favorite of mine was Death in the Sawtooths by Lindsay Smith. It stood out to me for having a protagonist who's a little older and looking back at the traumas of her magic school years, which is a perspective that I personally really identify strongly with at my age. Maddie's patron goddess is the Lady of Death, which made her an outcast at the conservatory where she studied, socially shunned and denied privileges given to her classmates. Now she practices her craft outside the capital, but is drawn back by a former nemesis to solve a dark magical mystery. I really enjoyed the reconciliation arc between these two characters. It's not clear to me whether this is supposed to be a contemporary, secondary urban fantasy world, or some sort of very magical alternate America, but whichever it is, it's obvious that the author knows a lot about this world and its magical practitioners, and I'd love to read a full novel about them. Another standout that felt very unique to me was the Moonapple Menagerie by Shwetha Thakura. Though not much about the setting is specified, it's clearly contemporary but steeped in South Asian mythology and folklore. We follow a coven of witches who are preparing to perform a magical play, which I loved since portrayals of magic as connected to the arts is one of my favorite things in fantasy. Ultimately, it's a story about writer's block, sources of inspiration, and trusting your friends with your insecurities. And the lyrical writing gorgeously blurs the lines between fiction and reality. The closest we get to fairy tale witches in this collection, which I am always on the lookout for because fairy tales are my favorite, is Daughters of Baba Yaga by Brenna Jovanoff. This story was actually one of my favorites as well, but it's an urban fantasy about a teenage descendant of Russian immigrants to the US, revolving around high school drama, and isn't itself written as a fairy tale. The reference is to the type of justice that Baba Yaga metes out, not to the structure of the tales in which she appears. I had honestly been hoping for more fairy tales, and I was disappointed. While there are a couple of historical stories in this collection, there aren't nearly as many of them as I would have expected given the long, complex history of beliefs surrounding witchcraft. Afterbirth by Andrea Kramer is the obligatory story of a midwife accused of witchcraft in 17th century New England, told from the perspective of her apprentice. The other obviously historical story is The Well Witch by Kate Hart, which is a western, a young woman who lives alone in a house with a well that's a haven in the dry land, is gradually forced into a horrific situation by a group of traveling men who impose upon her hospitality. I'd venture that the progression of this story may be upsetting to some readers. It was a little to me. One of the stories that puzzled me the most was Beware the Girls with Crooked Mouths by Jessica Spotswood, because I could not for the life of me tell whether it was supposed to be historical or not. It's a dark story about three sisters from a family of doomed witches, and a turn their lives take as a result of a prophetic vision. And it seems to take place in some version of the real world, since Scotland is mentioned, though it doesn't take place there. There are high society ladies in corsets and gowns, so historical, but there's also a high-profile marriage engagement between two women, so alternate history? There just aren't enough information points to paint a picture of what I'm supposed to be imagining here, and it frustrated me. The tone of these stories also occupies a fairly narrow range, from introspective to inspirational to angry. They are all to the one so utterly earnest. It's commendable, I suppose, seeing so many authors so intent on teaching their young readers profound lessons in a feminist anthology for teens. But at a certain point, I'd have done dark deeds for some comedic relief. I couldn't help but think that an adult anthology on the same theme wouldn't have been so restrained. Another thing I tend to enjoy about adult witch stories that I didn't see much of here is portrayals of women who are already comfortable and competent in their powers and abilities, whose skills are employed in a wide variety of thematic scenarios. Many of these girls are on their way there, but for now, they're still coming into their own. In addition to The Well Witch, I can see the content in a couple other of these stories being rough for some readers, specifically those that spotlight harrowing abuse at the hands of men. I'd include a content warning for rape for The One Who Stayed by Nova Ren Suma. It's told from the collective perspective of a group of witches in the woods as they prepare to welcome a potential new member, a girl who we learn is fleeing her assaulters in the immediate wake of an attack. The narrative device is interesting, and so is the perspective of a group of witches as a secret society of survivors. But the story is one of the more skeletal ones without a ton of detail. The other story in which witchcraft is a defense that women develop in the wake of abuse by men as opposed to inheriting it from their families is Why They Watch Us Burn by Elizabeth May, which is the final story in this collection. May paints a near-future dystopian scenario where women who are survivors of sexual assault are not only disbelieved when they accuse powerful men, but literally convicted of witchcraft themselves as a result and either burned at the stake or sent to prison camps. I get why this is placed at the end. It's probably the angriest and therefore one of the most powerful stories, but it also ended the book on a very dark note, again leaving me feeling raw and upset. I wondered if the editors and the author might have handled this grand finale a little differently if it had been written and published in the wake of the recent Supreme Court debacle in this country instead of before. So I gave this collection overall a 3-star rating. While I preferred some of these stories over others, I don't think any of them are real duds, which is an outstanding achievement in its own right. So if the theme of this anthology interests you, by all means, I would recommend it. But I would suggest taking it 1 or 2 stories at a time in order to fully appreciate them, as opposed to binging it cover to cover. Or you might wind up with a case of contemporary teen witch fatigue like I did. Anyhow, let me know in the comments if you've read this book or if you're planning to. Let me know what you think. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.